So what do we got here? Live demo. Okay, I guess that would be my cue to talk now. Let's go. If I can find my screen here. Okay, live demo. So I'd like to do two different sort of interfaces here. Let's start with the easy one that we've been talking about, and that would be our ODBC. So what I have here is I'm the customer, and I have a table called sample data, and it's got a bunch of rows, and it's got 3 columns. This is a very simple example to give you the idea. It's got an ID, which is kind of an internal ID, a number. That usually won't mean anything to a customer. It has a lookup value, a value, and a timestamp. And if I select the top 100, you can see here we got IDs, which are just an index on the table. We have, looks like 2 different values here, a random and sawtooth, a value, and a timestamp. So what the customer is going to ask for is, well, I got these 2 things, sawtooth and random, and I want to know, I want to use them in my KPIs. So great. So now what we need to do is we got 3 queries to worry about. Let's see if I did this right. So here's the current value, okay, just for sawtooth. So I'm selecting the top 1 value, timestamp as date, because again, we need value and date, from this table where the lookup equals sawtooth and timestamp is less than or equal to now. That's how I get it. And what I want to do, obviously, so that's, I could put that in my interface. But then I'd obviously parameterize sawtooth because we have another thing they want, which is called random. So if I go into my interfaces here on this particular thing, I'm going to go ahead and say
just for a little context there, Christian. So Christian in the background has SQL Management Studio running, and here in the foreground is the Visual KPI Server Manager, which I don't think any of you have seen before. And so he has a server that is running multiple instances of our software. And the instance of our software we're on right now, which, Christian, if you put your mouse on, is Transpara. And underneath that, we have another interface training. And that's the instance. Server, right? And then you have interfaces, remote context services, and other things there. So he's going under the interfaces tab, and this is the place in the Visual KPI Server Manager that you set up an interface.
Right. So what I want to do here is I'm going to say install new interface. It's a simple little wizard here. I'm going to agree to the terms. Name is an important thing. I mean, really talking about, how many data, is there an interface per data source? Really, if you're getting, this is about reactors, or this is about, IT, could be computer IT information. You don't just want to name it ODBC. You want to give it a name. Maybe we're dealing with reactors here, right? So we do ODBC reactors. Just give it a nice human readable name. It does show up in the designer, so it's important to be able to select it and kind of give it a name that is descriptive enough to where they know, oh yeah, this isn't where I get sales data from. This is where I get computer temperatures from, or whatever it may be.
And it could be the data source like SCOM or something.
Could be, right?
Or could be SCOM plus a certain type of thing you're getting from SCOM if you're going to do multiple interfaces to SCOM.
Yeah, it could be like SCOM reports, whatever you want to call it, descriptive. I'm just going to call it training because that's what we're doing right now. It's going to say, what do you want to install to? Defaults are fine on this. It's going to ask you for a connect string. If you can't verify through here, you can just uncheck and it'll say, okay, I'll skip the verification process. We can do that later. Just a few questions and then it installs. By default, it will put in, I've now clicked on this here, and there's a couple things you can set. These get a little picky. Sometimes customers have databases in a different locale or a different time zone, and time matters because we're passing in dates. If they're in a different time zone or a different locale than the web server itself, then you can adjust these accordingly. Not often that happens, but it does happen occasionally. Obviously, if a connect string and a command timeout, if you have to start worrying about command timeouts, like it's not coming back in 30 seconds, then you probably have a problem the customer needs to help you address, and that is either, I'm not going to say it's a poorly indexed system, but it may not have been indexed with the same goals in mind that we need. So that does happen from time to time. Things like execution timeout, how long does it take to execute, max how much data is coming back. You shouldn't really have to worry about this sort of stuff. Really what you're going to matter in this particular case is the connect string, and then you're going to have, in this case, 3 queries, which we'll get to. Once you have entered the connect string, you can always see a good step is to say, okay, can I connect? So you can right click and say verify. So now I have an interface defined. I have a connect string that works, and I'm able to connect to the database. Now I want to write my queries. So lo and behold, our queries here, I'm going to delete them. So because this is the sample data, which is the same data I'm going to be using, but I'm going to remove them so we can write them together and show you how this would work. So let's talk about current value. So here I have my current value for Sawtooth. So I'm going to take that same query, I'm going to copy it, I'm going to go to get current value, and I'm going to paste it in. Here though, I don't just want where it equals Sawtooth, I want to make this a parameter. And our parameters start with 0 because we're computer geeks underneath, and this is pretty geeky, so we're a 0-based index. So I'm going to replace the word Sawtooth with squiggly brace 0, squiggly brace, and the quotes matter because this one happens to be a text field that I'm looking up. If this was an integer field, then you wouldn't put the quotes around it. Now when I test it,
or a real value, it wouldn't. It's not just integers; it'd be
right.
Numeric.
Right. So now when I test it, I can pass in a parameter. So I'm going to try random because that's one of the other ones. And what happens here is it tells you here's the modified query. So you can see I've replaced the 0 with the word random, and I've gotten back a value and date. If you make mistakes, if this is select one, top one timestamp as date 2, for instance, in my query, and I test this, it will tell you, oh, hey, it needs to return 2 columns, value and date. We're missing date. So it does give you some help. It's not the greatest, but it gives you some help. So again here, the key is to start with the native tools. Write a very simple query or a query that works with a fixed set of data, and then figure out how to parameterize it. This may have 5 or 6 parameters. If it did have 5 or 6 parameters, then the query would look like this, P1, P2, so on and so forth, with pipes separating them. That's kind of a thing we use as parameters to interfaces. We separate with pipes. In my case, I have one parameter, so I can change this now to Sawtooth. And it's returning, oh, I'm still going to change my date, and now it's going to return Sawtooth, which is 455 versus random, which is 728 point whatever. So now I have a parameterized interface and a parameterized query for get current value. So we're done with current value. Well, let's move on to our next query, and that is the trend data. Okay, so here again I have a simple query. Let's just look at the first part here because this is maybe a little bit more advanced. So let's just start with this first part. Here I have the same thing. If you remember my first current value query here, where I'm selecting the top one where it's Sawtooth. Here in the trend, I don't want just top one. I want a bunch of data. And I want it where lookup equals Sawtooth and timestamp is between just 2 dates. Okay, and if I run that, I get back data. So that is probably the low-level way, the easiest way to get a trend back. However, you can see this data here is spaced out, maybe it's minute-by-minute data, I think, or hour-by-hour data. If they asked for a trend that didn't fall on the hour boundaries, what you're going to see is you're not going to get data back. With the earliest piece of data we have here, if I ordered this, will be at an hour boundary. If we ask for the trend on the half-hour boundary, we're going to have missing data on the ends because the data we set, oh, give it to us between these 2 dates. So what the server will do is if you pass in values before the start and values after the start, it will then interpolate kind of the missing end pieces that this first part didn't pick up and give you a nice even trend that goes all the way to the edge of the screen. And how we do that is a simple union where I'm basically getting a value here where it's less than the start date and a value here where it's right after the end date, and I union all that together to get a larger set of data. And even though these 2 points here weren't asked for, they may ask for something that falls in between those points, and this will allow us to kind of aggregate and interpolate the trend curve. So we're going to take this same query. I'm going to go back to my Visual KPI Server Manager. I'm going to go into the Get Trend Data query. I'm going to paste it in, and we want to parameterize. And it's important if get current value had one parameter, or say it had two parameters, then we want two parameters in here as well. In our case, we had one. So I'm going to replace the word sawtooth. And in this case, it's going to be 3 times. And try not to make typos. And we got some hard-coded dates in here, and that's not going to work. In the hard-coded dates, we have the keywords. Again, in squiggly braces, this is going to be start date. And you don't need the quotes for start date and end date because we know that those are going to be quoted. And end date. And I'm going to just copy this, and this guy here also has an end date. And this guy here has a start date. Now if I test this, then I pass in random and I pick any 2 dates. So let's make this go back here to make this 418. And it tells me what my modified query is. So if this isn't working, you can always take this modified query. Make sure I got it all. And I can just go over to back to my client tools if I need to test, and it's got some brackets on the end so you can see where it starts and ends, and you can run it. And this will help you debug. It's like, okay, I got some weird error, what's going on here? And the native tools are obviously going to be better at debugging than what we have. However, this query worked just fine. So it gives you how much you got back, gives you the modified query, and it gives you your data. And again, value and date, and it's a series of it. And that's enough for our trend. Apply that. The last query we're going to write is our historical value. So if you remember back to our current value, select top one, where timestamp is less than or equal to get date, which is now. It's almost going to be the same query, except we're going to say, instead of timestamp being less than now, we're going to say whatever random date they want it to be, less than or equal to. When I run that, I'm going to get data back, historical data back. I'm going to copy that, simple as this, go back to my tool, paste this in, and parameterize. Again, we have one parameter only. And for our third and final keyword, instead of this hard-coded date, timestamp. It's not a start or an end date, it's just a timestamp. And if I test this, I'll put in random. I get a value for random at 523. If I change the date, and this is at or before, so even though it said 524, it's giving me the nearest value. If I made this, I don't know, 424, I'm going to get the nearest value prior.
Yeah. Christian, add an hour in there as well, just to give a timestamp as well in the query.
Add what?
Add an hour instead of just a date. So specify in your test 0800 or 1251 or whatever, just to show that there's, the ability to query that. It'll be the closest thing to that value. And the purpose, we just need to clarify, the purpose of this historical value is so that you can scroll back in time for single valued things. So for example, if you've got a Pareto chart or a bar chart and you want to scroll the entire chart back in time, you'll need the values of those things that are on the bar chart or the Pareto chart as of a previous date. So this interface component gives you the ability to scroll single-valued things back in time.
That's correct. And now let's kind of round trip this. We got our interface working here, and let's create a couple of new KPIs. So I'm going to go into the Visual KPI Designer now, and let me just that's fine. And I'm going to say let's do a new KPI, and let's call this one random because our KPI is going to be called random. And we'll get to a big designer thing here, but if you remember, we had one parameter. So random was the one parameter, and the interface it was coming from was called ODBC training. Okay. So now if I preview this, I'm going to get back. It's going to run the get current value, and that works. If you get to this point, you're kind of done. It's all going to work. I can now create another KPI here, and we'll call it sawtooth. And this is just our sample test data, obviously. Spelled correctly. And this guy here is going to be, I just did a cut and paste so I don't have to type everything in again. Sawtooth. Now if I preview both of these, I'm going to get two different pieces of data back. So same interface, written one query. I'm now getting two pieces of data back that are different based on the parameters that are passed in. So what's happening in the background is I'm going to the server and I'm saying, hey, for this interface called ODBC training, here are the values I need. I need a current value for random and a current value for sawtooth. So now go in and parse those queries, string replace the parameters with random and sawtooth, and give me back the data. And if I put those into a group, like we'll stick them on the home group, and I hit save, and if I go ahead and open the website, and I go to groups, there I have my current value, and we've done some truncating and social interpolation on this, or some formatting of the number based on the system parameters. And here's my trends. This is my trend query running, and this is my trend query running for sawtooth. And if I kind of go back here and I look at the details of this, here I have the current value of 729. If I scroll back in time, I think that's going to work. It won't work right now because I'm on GoToMeeting. You would get the historical value of this as well.
Yeah, and so I think it's important to see the whole round trip we just did. So I don't know, in the last 15 minutes or so, we've set up an interface with a connect string, then wrote those 3 queries with one parameter in them, and then tested that. Then went over to the Visual KPI Designer, created 2 KPIs that pass in that parameter, and now it's live on the website.
Yeah, and if we had multiple parameters, say I'm getting a unit and what value do I want, then again we separate them with this pipe. And this is why you don't want 10 or 20, because especially if only 3 are ever used at once, you get this big long thing that doesn't make sense.
It's also important to think about the audience, because you might be very good at SQL and queries, and it might be very sophisticated what you want to do, but you might not be the one who's going to go into the designer and create new KPIs. So you want these parameters to be human readable things, because you may have a business person who's coming in here and saying, I want the temperature in Houston, or I want the rainfall in Houston, and it needs to be human readable like that, rather than it's X25 pipe 2716V. You want to make sure that it's something that a business user is going to be ready to use.
And just to show you, we talked about CTEs. I won't get into a CTE, but I could create, let's call this ODBC training current value. Just to show you, you can kind of do it. I can take my current value query here, and this is going to, let me take let's call it lookup 50. Just for fun here, and I'm going to take the same query we wrote here, and just to show you how you could make this a store procedure if you chose to. Okay, and then lookup equals lookup. Run that, and now if I wanted to, so if you have these really complex, you probably don't want to type it all in here. So then what you can do is you can just do this. Oops. These, and I can pass in here. Same sort of thing. Now you've got all that data in a store procedure. And modify queries, syntax of training. What did I do wrong? ODBC training, current value. ODBC training. Oh, I know what I did wrong. It's to be a string. No, remaining. Modify query. It's training. It doesn't like the dashes in the store procedure now. This is going to be great. There we go. So now it's a store procedure that I've executed and still returning the results back. So you can kind of do what you want here under the covers. You can put it where you want. You can make them store procedures. You can do whatever you need. As long as I get back a result set with value and date, we're happy.
So, Christian, speaking of value and date, one of the most common things I run into is when you you make a query for the current value and it works great. You make a query for the historical value and it works great. But the same query, when you modify it for the trend, it doesn't work. And it's 100 times out of 100 because of the database time format. So there is the most common thing you're going to run into when you go to write the trend query is that the date time formats are a little bit wonky. So you have to get the date time format string in that field right there that says date time format. You have to get that matching the data source so that when you get a trend data set back, it's not a single value that .NET does a really good job of converting, but a vector of values that it'll convert correctly. So if you run into a problem, I would say 99 times out of 100, it's going to be the date time format in the trend query.
Yeah, and then you can just, this is kind of a standard .NET formatting string that you can pass in. And I think of the capital M's, right, Michael? I can't remember. If I run something like this.
Yeah. Yeah,
I didn't like that date time format in this particular case. So,
yeah,
but
so
you can see here, yeah, it's
the capital M's are
lowercase y's.
Lowercase y's is good, and capital H's are 24-hour time format, and lower H's are 12-hour time format.
Yeah, so now if I do this, now you can see here in the past query, I formatted it in the way that it's the inbound formatting to the query. So if you do run into issues of time formatting, you can use that.
Yeah, it's very common in the trend query, and almost never have trouble in the current value and the history.
And Christian, if we could just show one more thing, can you go back to the website, show your KPIs?
Yep.
And just pull up the trend of the random, maybe? So just by doing that, you now have this ability to go back and forward in time, do everything you want with this, all kinds of fun stuff with just executing on that one interface. You've pulled all the necessary information for this particular value. And Christian, I think it might make sense if you just go add a quick target or limit to this so that we show how it switches from a value to being a KPI.
Let's put a target. Let's say it's let's say the high. If it's above 75, we're going to call this high, and I can hit save on that. And again, these could also come from interfaces, right? So I'm hard coding a target of 50 and a high of 75. Maybe that's in a different data source. I can write a query for that. The same thing we just did. So now if I refresh this, now this is quite a high KPI because the numbers are all way up here. So let's change that limit to say 1,000. So now I got my high at 1,000. So when it's above 1,000, KPI is high. When it's below, it's going to be good. And right now, this one is high, or this one is good at 729. So we're all set.
Christian, could you illustrate using a variable in the limit as well? Just take that sawtooth and put it in for one of the limits.
Sure.
Just take sawtooth there, copy that, and just put it over to a limit. Or target, yeah, that's good. That's good. That's good. Either one.
So I can say my target for this is sawtooth. And now if I click on this guy, you can see I got the target in here. And it's by default interpolated set to a step trend. Yeah. So my target is coming from the same interface. I'm getting my target and my limit, or my target and my actual.
So one more illustration, go ahead and multiply those two things together. So take that actual and just make it into a multiplication of those two inputs. Or any one of these things. Yeah, just make it sawtooth times random.
Okay.
Divided by whatever. So
we can also do math on these. We can say sawtooth. Oops. Do that again. Oops. Sorry, I forgot my screen is really big here. I'm not used to having a big screen. Sawtooth, I could say times is probably going to be really big. I'm just going to add them together.
Yeah, less random. That's fine.
I can take these same two things, and they're both coming from the same interface here. So I'm going to say from training. And let's preview to see what we got to make sure it's working. All right, so I got the target and an actual. Add them together, I get that. Well, that's looking good. And then if I put it in here, now we got a high value at the addition of those two. So you can start doing some interesting things. But again, in order to do that, we didn't change anything on the interface. The interface was a simple query, passing in parameters, getting back a date and a value, and then the system can do lots of neat things with it.
Hi, Christian. This is Murthy here again.
Well,
just one quick question. I just wanted to see, like, what is the date standard format you're using? Like, are we using UTC format or are we using local time format?
Okay, so the date formatting, so and the database, as Michael said, it depends. Depends what they set up. So right now, my database, I know because I wrote this data, is in the same time zone as my web server. If it wasn't, if the database was in UTC, you can say, oh, hey, this data is going to come back and it's UTC. I'm in Arizona right now. I can set it to whatever I want. So if you know that all the data is stored in, whatever, in Georgetown, La Paz time zone, you can set it to that. If it's in UTC, you can set it to UTC. If the date format is completely different, like they maybe have some strange formatting where it's always year, and then day, and then month, you can change that formatting here. So you got kind of two things. You got a time zone, a format, and then locale is important too. If the data is stored, the real numbers have commas instead of decimal points, and your server's in English and your data source is, maybe your web server is US English and maybe your data source is German, then you need to let us know that too, so we can say, oh, hey, the value 1,34 is 1.34 to us. So we can allow you to kind of set those settings as well.
Did that answer your question? Murthy, you there?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Great. So really, that's the it's in a nutshell how you do an ODBC interface. So again, start with the client tools. Start with a very simple query to get one piece of data back. Think about how we're going to parameterize this. Okay, there's one piece. What else are you going to need? You might not in this query here value as a column. That might not. You may have value 10, temperature, pressure. You can parameterize this as well if you wanted to. So you could say, give me this time out of the value, next time out of something else. So you can parameterize these all you want. You could technically pass in an entire query if you want and have that as your query, but that then your actual in your designer would look silly. So you want to try to keep a nice parameterized query in here that will make sense to like Robert said, will make sense to the end user when they're typing stuff in. Okay, for ODBC training, maybe I have 2 or 3 values that I pass in, X and Y. But don't do much more than that, because if you start getting these big long strings, it gets complicated and the end user won't know how to use it.